Hi, Roshni. We've set aside this time to talk about a report that you've just written called Growing Up Online. It's part of the Nuffield Foundation's Grown Up Journeys to Adulthood project, and it focuses on 14 to 24-year-olds. And at this moment, we're particularly interested in their digital lives because, of course, this generation of young people have had digital technology sort of woven through their everyday lives and is the first generation to have that throughout. And it affects their experiences, their opportunities, and their risks. So tell us a little bit about yourself. You're from the Ada Lovelace Institute, and we've been working together.
Yes, so I'm a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute. And at the Institute, we're very interested in how data and AI impacts people and society. So really thinking about technologies. On this project, I've been looking at the quantitative evidence base around young people and their digital experiences. So really drawing from large-scale attitudinal surveys to understand young people's relationships with digital technologies as they grow up. And we've been focusing for this piece of work on a few things. Firstly, what the data tells us about the level of access young people have to digital technologies, how they're spending their time with these tools, but also the psychosocial elements of growing up and what role digital technologies plays there. So looking at how technologies intersect with the forming of relationships, how young people come to kind of learn about themselves and their identities, but also how it might impact on their well-being and their development as they grow up as well.
And you've also been able to draw on the experiences and insights from our Youth Insight group, which is a group of 20 young people drawn from across the UK who've met throughout the project. And I think that their insights and thoughts obviously brings an up-to-date lens on some of the big trends that you're looking at.
Yes, that was so valuable for us as we were doing this work and kind of collating some of the key messages from the data. We really wanted to bring that back to this group of young people and get their thoughts, to understand what was resonating with them, and to really get to the bottom of where there might be some gaps in the data that need to be filled with further research.
Yes.
We were also interested in how satisfied young people were with the amount of time they were spending on devices, to help us kind of understand those measures a bit better and interpret the data around time use a bit more sensitively.
Yes.
And what we saw there was that young people at the younger end of our cohort were actually reporting higher levels of dissatisfaction with the amount of time they spent online than those at the higher end. We really heard from the Youth Insight group that they're feeling the pull towards technology. They're feeling the necessity of it in their day-to-day. At the same time, they're kind of balancing themselves, how they manage their relationship with these tools. And also the Youth Insight group really put to the forefront how the development of new technologies can often outpace our measurement of how young people are interacting with them. An interesting example here was the mention of AI chatbots for kind of support, companionship, as a way to kind of learn about new things. And although there's some kind of evidence in this space, this is relatively new and emerging technology, which is difficult for quantitative evidence, particularly large-scale surveys that really take time to develop, implement and analyse to keep up with. So a real challenge there.
Of course, a key aspect of growing up is the relationships that you start to form at this stage of life with your peers, with wider social networks. Friendship is incredibly important. What does the data tell us?
So the data is showing that digital technologies have an important role to play here, either in sustaining existing relationships or even helping young people build new relationships and expand their communities. And And to an extent, this is quite surprising in that I think a lot of our imaginings of young people and their relationship with technology tends to go into the space of isolation or introversion. But really, we're seeing that a lot of young people are reporting that things like social media can help them feel closer to their friends. So technology being part of like the infrastructure of relationships and friendships is coming through in the data.
Yes, that's really interesting. Related, I guess, to relationships is how young people form their identity. And of course, that's a very large topic, but you've been looking at how young people develop their own values, how they learn about themselves, and how they present themselves to others online. What have you found?
Yeah, so we really see this difference potentially in how young people present themselves online versus in person.
Yes.
So many young people are reporting feeling more confident when they're online, and some studies suggesting that online communication can buffer anxiety some young people might feel in social situations. So potentially quite positive impact there. But at the same time, there are negative impacts on self-esteem that the data is highlighting as well. So for instance, nearly half of 14 to 22-year-olds report that they feel other people's lives are better than their own. So potentially negative impacts of social comparison that can kind of come through from being with these digital technologies. And then for some groups of young people, online experiences can be both identity affirming in that they give you that kind of uplift that can be quite helpful, but identity attacking as well. So for instance, there's studies with LGBTQ plus youth, and these young people are reporting that they see comments online that both celebrate LGBTQ plus identities, but also attack these identities a lot more frequently than non-LGBTQ plus peers. So we can say that there's potentially a double-edged nature to technology. So we're really describing these moments where young people are exposed to both kind of benefit and opportunity, as well as kind of additional exposure to risk, scrutiny, or even kind of hateful or hurtful experiences.
Yes. So this brings us on to the question of harms more generally. So of course there's a lot of concern about young people's experience and use of social media in particular, but more broadly, and the ways in which that it can damage them, whether we're talking about a one-off experience or damage them more profoundly in terms of how they're developing and whether they're thriving or not. What do you think your research sort of sheds light on in that area?
Yeah, so kind of sitting with that social media debate to start with, cross-sectionally, so when looking at one moment in time, we really do see these negative impacts that young people are reporting in terms of how social media makes them feel about their own lives, their well-being, or even more specific measures around kind of concentration and attention.
Yes.
And young people tending to report quite negative associations across those things. But the data is showing that longitudinally there isn't a lot of support for a causal relationship here between specifically social media and poor kind of mental health, which is an area of real policy importance at the moment. And this isn't to say that this connection doesn't necessarily exist, but the evidence to date is quite limited. So we know things like existing self-esteem or social support can kind of mitigate or protect young people from some of these negative kind of well-being outcomes that we sometimes see in the data there. So really it might be the case that these questions aren't really best explored quantitatively. There are just too many life factors really to control for here. And I think this is an area where qualitative evidence can really help us understand these issues a little bit further.
Yes. Are there any harms that are unique to online spaces?
We focused on some specific harms that are quite unique to online spaces. So kind of experiences of cyberbullying, which is different to bullying that might happen in person, in the sense that it can follow a young person regardless of the context they're in, the location they're in, and time as well. It can happen around the clock. And we see here that vulnerabilities, so specifically young people who might be more vulnerable in terms of their disability status or whether they have any additional support needs, can mean that they're more vulnerable to experiences of cyberbullying as well. So it's something to be really kind of mindful of as we're thinking about online harms. And quite interestingly, we're seeing that a lot of young people are saying that or reporting that they feel safe online, whilst also experiencing content that as adults we might class as quite harmful. So for instance, kind of very violent content or even misinformation or AI generated deepfakes. There's quite high exposures that young people are reporting of this type of content, kind of sitting parallel to reporting of feeling safe online. So I really do think that's potentially an area for further investigation in terms of why those two things might exist in parallel. We can speculate as to whether maturity might play a role in here, and or even whether resilience to certain types of content or desensitization to certain types of content. But again, this feels like another area where I think qualitative evidence will help us understand these issues a bit further.
Absolutely, trying to unpack that and understanding the context in which the young person is engaging with that material it feels really important. So it's a really rich conversation. What would you say, the most important takeaways are from the research that you've been doing?
I think primarily that the data is showing that there isn't a unified experience of what it means to grow up with digital technologies. And sometimes this kind of branding of an entire generation as digital can therefore be quite unhelpful, because sitting underneath that is this real diversity of experiences that we're seeing in terms of how young people are spending their time online, the benefits that they're experiencing, the potential risks and harms they're exposed to, and their overall kind of relationship with these tools. We see kind of in areas that being part of communities that are often marginalized or minoritized can impact upon these experiences, both positively and negatively. So coming back to that double-edged nature of technologies. But within this, there's some quite limitations in the quantitative evidence base. So we can't really understand the intersecting nature of these identities in much detail, and how this might lead to quite unique experiences or interfaces with digital technologies. And at the same time, we're really relying quite heavily on self-report, which we, of course, has kind of well-established limitations that we need to recognise. So I think a big takeaway here, and our Youth Insight group alluded to this quite a bit, is that there's a lot of value we can get from having young people themselves play more of an active role in setting the agenda for research, co-producing methods, making these decisions on what we measure and what we don't, and how we interpret some of these findings here. And so I do feel like that's an area where we can lean into, and the evidence will just be all the more richer for it.
I wanted to just address one issue that we haven't talked about, which is the quantitative data that's held by the tech companies. And so we're struggling with large-scale data studies that are not up to date for all the reasons that you described when we first started the conversation. And yet, of course, there is real-time data available, but it's very difficult to access.
Yeah. This is a huge kind of tension, isn't it, in the space?
It is.
In the sense that there are vast amounts of data available on young people, and it really speaks to a power imbalance.
Absolutely.
A power imbalance in the ecosystem, that a lot of this is privately held. And so I think, there's some really important conversations and live debates happening around data access and use. The Ada Lovelace Institute is doing quite a bit of research in this space as well, in terms of what fair data access and use means, what consent might mean in these spaces, and how do we kind of address these power imbalances that are so stark. So yeah, I think it's really important to raise that and think about those questions a bit more deeply.
Thank you, Roshni. That's such an insightful conversation. So what I take away from the conversation is really the complexity and nuance that is incredibly important to hold on to when we're talking about young people's digital lives, because this is also quite a binary and polarized debate that's going on in terms of the public conversation. And also just to say, this is the first of our outputs in this area. We're going to have some reports from young people directly themselves, and some think pieces that come both from young people, but also with a sort of parent perspective hat on, and how you negotiate young people's digital lives, within a household. So many thanks for sharing your thoughts, and we will continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been really great speaking with you.
Pleasure.